introduce our panelists. We have Patricia Weekly, Director of Equity, Inclusion, and Sanctuary at Morrison Child and Family Services. Esteemed colleague Lily Hogue, Political Director of Family Forward Oregon. And Mari Watanabe, Executive Director of Partners in Diversity at the Portland Business Alliance. So the data that I'm drawing from is from the Count Her In report, which is the first comprehensive report about women and girls in Oregon in about 20 years. And if you take only one sentence about how women and girls in Oregon are doing, the sentence is that women and girls in Oregon are giving more but getting less than women and girls in most other states. The report includes 8 things to celebrate, which are just the tip of the iceberg for things that Oregon women and girls are doing exceptionally well. Everything from civic engagement, voting at higher rates, performing extraordinary amounts of caregiving, often unpaid, which is not to celebrate. We'll talk about that more. We're the most physically active women and girls in the country. Education and healthcare. 70% of Oregon's public school teachers and 80% of our healthcare workers are women. We're more generous with money and time. We serve in elected office at higher rates. And educational attainment, we met the goal a decade. Oregon's girls met the goal for higher educational attainment a decade ahead of schedule. On the flip side, we have identified what we call the 8 that can't wait. And these are 8 incredibly pressing issues where Oregon is falling behind the rest of the nation, which is already often behind the rest of the developed world. We talked to 1,000 women and girls across the state, and no matter where we were, these were the 8 issues that were rising to the top. And these are also issues where we see a huge disparity between how women and girls are doing in Oregon and how men and boys are doing. The first is violence against women. Oregon has some of the highest rates of violence against women in the nation. Over half the women in Oregon have experienced some form of sexual or domestic violence in their lifetime. Systemic racism. Oregon has an appalling history when it comes to an incredibly institutionally and structurally racist past. And the women and girls of color in Oregon, of whom there are almost 500,000, live at the intersection of the racism and sexism that is ever present here in Oregon. The cost of caregiving, which should really be called the unaffordability of caregiving. Oregon is among the least affordable states in the nation when it comes to the cost of caregiving for both child and elder care. And it now costs more to send your toddler to a year of childcare than it does to send a freshman to U of O for a year. Barriers to reproductive health. Almost half of the pregnancies in Oregon each year are unintended. And that tells us that we have a systemic lack of access and information regarding how, when, and whether to start a family for women and girls in Oregon. The wage and wealth gap. Oregon has the second worst wealth gap in the nation. Oregon women hold only 35 cents in wealth compared to dollars held by Oregon men. Next is economic fragility. This is really a poverty number. Almost a third of Oregon families, most of them headed by women who are single-family head of households, are experiencing what we call economic fragility, which means that if they have a single unexpected expense of even $100, they can't navigate it without selling something or borrowing money. They're living on the precipice of financial disaster every single day. The next is mental health. Oregon has some of the highest rates of depression, reported alcohol and drug abuse, attempted suicides, and adverse childhood experience scores in the nation. In fact, Oregon women have the highest incidence of reported depression in the nation. The public-private glass ceiling. We have wild underrepresentation by women in leadership, both in the public and the private sector, and even more egregious underrepresentation for women of color. So as I mentioned, these 8 are taken all together. They're sort of locked in a constant cycle of cause and effect. And if you think about what's holding women and girls in Oregon back, don't think about any one of these issues, think about the web. Because these are all just symptoms of the same disease, which is oppression and inequity.
So Partners in Diversity is a nonprofit organization. We are housed under the Portland Business Alliance, which is the Chamber of Commerce. They're the largest chamber of commerce in our state. And the work we do, we work with employers on their equity, inclusion, and diversity work. We know that I'm going to focus more on women of color, but we do focus on people of color. But we do want to help employers become a more equitable, inclusive, diverse workforce. So we help the employer side, and so that they will be a more welcoming place for women of color. Equality is really about everybody getting the same. So in the photo on the on your left-hand side, so the fence, each of the little boys has the same box, so everyone gets the same thing. So what's fair, what's equal, but then is it really the right thing to do? Because the little boy that's standing on the single box, he still can't see over the fence to the ball game. So the equity is all about getting what people need. So the tall boy obviously doesn't need a box, but the little boy does. So he gets 2 boxes and the tall boy gets 0 boxes. Some of the ways we help women of color is to really start at the top. We believe that the CEO or the president or whoever is at the top of that organization really owns this work, and they are accountable for the success or the non-success of it being implemented in their organization. So we work with them directly. We work with them on just understanding of what diversity, equity, inclusion is. One other program we do is called Breakfast for Champions, and so this is where we work with HR and diversity practitioners sharing best practices. It's an opportunity for them to also build their own network with each other. And then this is our most popular event that we have. It's called Say Hey. And so for women of color, this is a great way to meet other women of color. And the purpose of this event is to really introduce new professionals of color who have moved to Oregon and Southwest Washington. That's a very important step to getting people who move here ingrained in our community, because we also know that if they don't get ingrained here, they'll leave after 1 or 2 years. And we have seen a lot of people leaving lately. And part of it is because they weren't able to find their community, not necessarily because they didn't like their job. Barriers. I would say access to leadership positions. So there's very dismal statistics out there nationwide about women of color not being seen in the C-suite. For Asians, it's like 2.4%. For Hispanics, it's like 4%. I think blacks is about the same. And so for women of color, that is a huge barrier for us, is we are not seen as leaders for organizations. So I feel like that is something that we need to really work on and be able to find sponsors and mentors that will help us pull us up that ladder. And for Asians, we call it the bamboo ceiling, and break that bamboo ceiling.
Morrison Child and Family Services is a nonprofit, and they offer assistance to family kiddos, as we call them, in regard to trauma-induced circumstances that have a negative impact on their well-being.
So from your perspective, particularly I think I would say for vulnerable women who have faced trauma, adversity, and stress, or from kids who are coming out of those circumstances, what are the biggest barriers to healthy participation in a 21st century workplace?
Well, I think the biggest barrier is that we have systems and institutions that have historically been in place that are designed to benefit one culture over other cultures. So I refer to that culture as dominant culture. I refer to other cultures as subordinate cultures. And those systems have been in place for many, many years. And in order for us to have meaningful parity and to reduce the trauma of those with marginalized identities, we're going to have to interrupt those systems and look at them from a perspective of, as we do with the sanctuary model, not what's wrong with you, but what happened to you. And in the case of those who experience trauma because of marginalization based on their identities, which can be race or gender or ethnicity, we're going to have to flip the switch and think, what is it that we are doing that's going to interrupt those inequitable outcomes and allow us to achieve equitable outcomes?
We have a lot of prominent Nobel laureate economists who said that the biggest change to the workforce in the 20th century was the mass entry of women into the workforce. And that's a lie, because what we know from the historical data and what was completely erased from the history of women in the workforce is that women of color and low-income women have been in the workforce for centuries. there was no way for them not to participate in the workforce. And their participation in the workforce actually made it possible for affluent and middle income, often white women, to not participate in the workforce because of their paid and unpaid labor in the home and in caregiving responsibilities. So can we talk about that narrative for a minute and the many other ways in which marginalized women, women of color, low-income women, women who've experienced trauma have been written out of the narrative, and how we are not designing the systems with them in mind?
Marginalized women, especially women of color, low-income women, and what their rights are, all I can think of is the intersectionality of oppression that they struggle with, and race always rises to the top. Everything's about race. And so when we think about that experience, when I think about my experience as a baby boomer and my mom's experience and my sister's experience and my aunt's experience, it has a different perspective, and that is just trying to overcome what it's like in day-to-day life to be a person of color in America. And then I think in terms of how is that oppression going to be addressed from a feminist perspective? I also recall how disengaged women of color were in the suffrage movement, even though they had very much to contribute. And as Emily mentioned earlier, women of color have always been infused into the workforce out of necessity. What they were not allowed to experience was a growth of career or occupation or talent because of that need to meet fundamental basic requirements for living, food and shelter, and then having to do that, to meet those needs in ways that didn't make allowances for their roles as mothers and wives.
My name is Lily. I'm the political director at Family Forward Oregon. We're an advocacy organization that works to change both our policies and our culture to value caregiving. So that means that we bring together mothers and other caregivers to look, and thank you, Patricia, to look at the intersection of race, class, and gender as it relates to who's caregiving and why, and how that impacts their ability to thrive financially, emotionally, mentally, physically. And I just want to point out that this organization was started and talking about World War II and what that meant for women joining the workforce. And in fact, we actually started having a culture of white dominance when white Europeans came over to the United States, and they actually enslaved other people. And so Black and African women have been working as caregivers for white folks since sort of the days that we, quote, founded this country in its current formation. And throughout that, Black women and immigrant women have been working, and they've been working in caregiving positions, often for white families, for centuries. And so when we're talking about who's in the workforce and who's not, and I thank you both for talking about that, what we're talking about is really shifting that very long-term dynamic about who's been working in paid caregiving. That's women of color, that's particularly Black women and immigrant women, and currently immigrant Latino women, and who's in the paid workforce making more money. That's often white women and white men, and how we balance it so that everyone has access to the ability to thrive at work, but also actually thrive at home in a way that doesn't make any one person make that constrained choice. And the reason that these things haven't shifted is that it's all good and fine for us to get the vote, but we don't actually value that invisible care work that all of us are doing. It is the work that makes all other work possible. And we don't value it specifically because the paid part of it, whether you're providing childcare, elder care, care for someone with a disability, is disproportionately done by women of color. And the unpaid care work is done by mostly women. It hasn't changed because our policies haven't caught up. and hint they haven't caught up because the people who are making those policies do not reflect or represent the people who are really living in our communities and experiencing what we're all experiencing.
So can each of you actually take a moment and speak a little bit, either from your personal lived experience about this work-life conflict, or about what you see in the workplace, in your own workplace, about what you see structurally and policy-wise? Like, speak to that conflict and how it's not really a balance, but in fact a conflict.
I think that we always get these questions on, so women are always up at the front talking, and the question comes up like, how do you do the work-life balance? It's like you don't. This is why women need to be at the table, and we need to make space for them.
Part of our work is to absolutely center and focus on the people who are most impacted by lack of access to supports, and that is mothers of color and mothers and other caregivers. But that doesn't mean that it doesn't positively impact everyone, because what we know is that when people have paid family and medical leave, men are also offered the dignity to take time off to care for their families too, which we know they want to, and there often hasn't been access.
Very tactical for a minute, and discuss actual either workplace or state or local policies that we think would make a material difference for women, particularly women of color, in the workplace.
In the past, at Partners University has been around immigrants and refugees that come here with advanced degrees. So meaning they're doctors, lawyers, teachers, nurses, psychologists, pharmacists, and they're not able to work here in Oregon because their credential is not recognized by Oregon. Consequently, where they end up working is in a minimum wage job. We're working on trying to ask the licensure boards to help find pathways for these professionals of color who come here and are not using their skills and not adding to the economic development of Oregon. We did some research, and there's 15,000 immigrants and refugees with advanced degrees here, but none of them are working in their field.
Everything that we engage, everything that we encounter around how to thrive and survive, particularly as women of color, has been in place and designed by something that's completely different from who we are. We don't fit into that dominant culture mode. And so there are consequences for not fitting into that mode. So I think the thing that would help us to survive and to thrive would be just a sobering acknowledgement of that reality, and then a commitment to appreciate, as Mari said, that the cultural nuances that make us who we are and that make our society so rich are not deficits. And so as we view and engage women, and particularly women of color, thinking in terms of what is it about the thing that I administer, the system that I inherited, the institution that I manage, that's prohibitive to someone that looks like me.
So we've done all this work to make what I would call traditionally men's jobs good jobs. So we built roads and bridges, and we made them good union jobs. And what we haven't done is made women's jobs good jobs. So we still pay care providers miserable wages. They don't have access to regular union, like access to joining a union. They don't have access to career benefits, ladders or lattices. But also, we actually don't acknowledge that this isn't a system that can survive without public funding. So just like K through 12, just like Social Security, just like Medicaid, this is a social infrastructure system that we need to choose to invest in so that everyone who's providing childcare has a good job and can provide for their own family, and that everyone who needs childcare can access that childcare at the hours they need, in the type of facility they need, whether that's with their friend, family, or neighbor, or it's in a childcare center that's culturally and linguistically appropriate and that meets their financial needs.
When you talk about making policies or even decisions, that when you put the folks who are most vulnerable or most impacted at the center, that the policy that you come up with tends to be good for everybody.
It's understanding what's at stake, and in understanding what's at stake, you have to understand what brought us to this place around inequity and exclusion, and why is that making me feel uncomfortable or threatened?
We need, again, more women in leadership positions. We need to see their voices at the table. So anything you can do in your world to help that would be appreciated.
What are you involved in, and how can you change or think about your behaviors that would make what I would call political and cultural change? So what are the ways that you can engage in racial and gender justice work?